I've been prototyping a game about a colony of ant people. I'm calling them ant people because they are people-like. They can build mud huts and they can bake bread and use tools and generally just be industrious. But they're also ant-like because they swarm and they have sort of a hive mind behaviour. I find it's really quite fun to watch them run around and go about their business. And I'm planning to develop this into a full game. However, the game originally didn't start out like this. In fact, the original idea didn't have ants in it at all. And it's been a long and bumpy chain of prototypes to get from my original concept to this one. And I think that this perhaps sheds a light into what game development is really like, especially in the early stages, especially if you're trying to do something new and innovative. It's not always straightforward. You have to do a lot of trial and error, and a lot of your ideas that might sound good on paper actually will suck once you try them out. So let's take a step back and go back to the beginning. There is a YouTube channel called Serpa Design, and this guy makes terrariums, which are basically like aquariums, except that they don't have water, they're land. And I've always really enjoyed this channel. It's really cool watching him construct a full ecosystem on a tiny scale. I think there's something peaceful here, there's something creative here, and it's just nice to look at them. And so I thought, hey, maybe I could make a game like this, a game about building terrariums. It seemed natural that the game would have some kind of puzzle gameplay probably, so that you have to pair certain kinds of creatures or plants in the terrarium with other ones that are synergistic. And so I took early inspiration from my favourite minimalist town building games, in particular Islanders, where you're trying to build up a town by placing buildings in a way that you maximise their adjacency bonuses, and Dwarf Romantic, where you have these hexagonal tiles and you're trying to place the tiles such that their edges all line up with their neighbours, like in Carcassonne, the classic board game. However, both of these games are quite limited in a particular way, which is that once you figure out how to play the game, how to get the combos going, you kind of play it in the same way every time. There's not a lot of diversity or variety in the gameplay here. And so that was kind of my goal. Can we make a minimalist ecosystem building game that feels a bit puzzly and that lets you build a variety of different ecosystems? I thought it was an easy and simple concept, but trying to actually design and build this game has been painful. To begin with, I just grabbed a bunch of art assets from my last game, Patch Quest, and set up a grid and shoved them in there. The idea was this. In Islanders, you're trying to maximise your adjacency bonuses, but the thing is, that game explicitly defines which buildings every building interacts with. So it says on the sawmill that you get a bonus from the lumberjack. And this works for this game because there's only 25 different building types, many of which are quite rare, and so you can learn all these interactions and you can figure out how it all works together like a big puzzle. But I wanted to have different kinds of ecosystem, different kinds of puzzles in the game, and this approach won't scale. I can't say, oh, this tree combos with that tree, another tree, a bush, this other bush, and some grass, because it's just, like the matrix here is just going to end up being so big and complicated that no one could ever remember any of it. So my first plan was, okay, we need a new approach. Let's try and make them match on colour, right? So trees are going to be green and bushes are going to be red, and then each plant could also have a pattern, and it will boost its neighbours if the pattern matches their colours. So you have to place the trees in sort of a spaced out sort of diagonal grid like this, but then you place the bushes in a line, sort of like a hedge. Well, this idea really sucked. You could see right away that it was not going to work. It was way too rigid. There was no creativity here. It was a dead end. So, okay, next prototype. My new idea was to think about Tetris, which is a game everyone's played. Shapes drop in from the top, you try and fit the shapes together perfectly, and bada bing, bada boom, there's your game. It's very tactical and strategic because the game pieces have such weird shapes. And so I thought, okay, let's do that. Let's take all these plants and then let's give them quite detailed, precise outlines based on, their precise shape. And then fitting these different plants together now becomes a lot more tactical. And then for the matches, I thought, well, okay, let's give them labels. So some of them will be trees, some of them will be flowers, some of them will be flower trees, which means they have both of those labels. And when you place cards together, they get bonus points if they have matching labels. This idea was a lot better. You can see already there's an organic feeling here to fitting these plants together in a grid and trying to tessellate them perfectly. I definitely like it a lot more than the previous prototype, but the thing is, if we're honest, we can look at this and say, this ecosystem I'm building here is an ugly mess. There's just not a lot of cohesion going on in terms of colour, in terms of shape. It's hideous. So for the next version of this, I thought, okay, let's really try and simplify this down. Let's have just a few card types, and each card type can then have different appearances, and therefore different shapes. So you can still get that fitting together of the differently shaped cards, but now it's done with cards that are all sort of similar looking, so you get a lot more visual cohesion. And hey, maybe you can also get a bonus if you fully surround a card, so that's reinforcing this whole idea of packing things together. So at that point I was thinking, hey, you know, this actually looks a bit promising, maybe there's something here. But obviously, plants don't make an ecosystem. You know, an ecosystem is plants but also animals, right? You have plants that are eaten by herbivores, and then those herbivores are eaten by other animals, and this creates a food chain, or to be honest, more accurately, a food web of different food chains. That's what an ecosystem is, and that's what I need to capture if I want to get this idea of an ecosystem building game to work. To make this happen, I came up with a new concept, a new mechanic: quest cards. These cards basically have a simple condition on them, you charge up that condition, and then they give you a reward. So here I've got this big pumpkin, and the big pumpkin gets charged up by other vegetables, and then when it's fully charged up you get more vegetables. And then of course these vegetables have matching labels, which means you get points when you cluster them together, and there you go, we got a vegetable patch. And then the next step here is to have a rabbit, and the rabbit is also charged up by vegetables, so you place it near your vegetable patch, and it gives you burrows, which you can also place spread out around your vegetable patch for more points. And here you can see we're starting to get the beginnings of an ecosystem. This actually looks increasingly like something that could really exist, that could really happen. And I was feeling positive at this point, but here things really started to go downhill. Because I realised that while this is cool, you can't just have every single ecosystem work the same way. There's got to be variety, there's got to be differences between the different animals, between the different kinds of plants, or the game's just going to be super repetitive. So the natural thing seemed to be, well then let's add a whole bunch more mechanics. Let's make it so that different food chains behave in different ways. And so I came up with a lot of new ideas, some cards that have effects when you place them. Other cards have effects when you charge them up, other cards have effects that trigger at the end of the day, or effects that trigger when you surround them. A lot of different effects, a lot of different card types. And then I thought, okay, well maybe the animals could even eat the plants, you know, they sort of absorb them in and they get points and they level up and then you get even more cards, and oh my god, this whole thing was a disaster. This was just a mess. And in fact, when I came back to this prototype, because I've had to play all the prototypes again to make the video, this one, I couldn't even remember what I was doing. And this is a game that I made. I couldn't remember how the cards worked, how they linked together. It was a disaster. And in trying to figure out where I went wrong, well, to be honest, it was quite clear where I went wrong. I went back and played Islanders and thought, wow, this game is simple, and my game is a convoluted mess. How did I get here? How did this journey lead me on this path? And I think it's kind of weird, you know, it's probably a thing that all designers deal with if they're trying to make something minimalist in any way, is that you start with a simple idea and then it doesn't quite work, so you add more, and then, oh, that doesn't quite work, so you add a bit more, and before you know it, what you've made isn't simple at all anymore. But I figured, hey, maybe the problem is that the game is turn-based, you know, in a turn-based game, you have to explain a lot, whereas a real-time game has a big advantage, which is that you can make a move and then watch what happens, so you can sort of learn as you play. And that's an advantage, if not for removing complexity, then at least for learning how it works, which I think is ultimately just as good. This is where the idea of ants first came in, although they weren't ants at this point, they were tanklings, because they are creatures that live in your tank. Original naming, I know. I made a new prototype that had the tanklings. They came out of this little tankling colony, they collected cherries, they would eat the cherries, then they would bring them back to the colony and grow more tanklings, and they would sort of go on like this. This was another moment where I thought, there's something here that, like, watching these creatures move around, watching them go, watching them do things, it's fun. There's a little bit of excitement in just seeing them live, seeing them go about their daily lives. But ultimately, this didn't sit right with me either, I think because they're so frantic, they're given all this work to do, they're constantly collecting cherries, they're behaving like automatons, they're pretty one-dimensional. And so I thought, yeah, maybe let's park this as well. And I went down a few more other dead ends and I decided, actually, maybe the matching idea, this idea of placing cards that match each other next to each other, is good, and I just went wrong by adding too many supporting mechanics around it. What if I really hone in on that one mechanic of matching? And that's when I came up with this version. So now, whenever you place a card, any nearby card that it matches will spawn a little resource, and that resource will be sent to your colony of tanklings. And this makes them happy, this makes this counter go down, and then they level up and give you new cards. On top of this, if you place them near these quest cards here, they'll also receive the resources, and eventually they will level up and you can get new cards that way. So basically the whole thing is just place the card, match things, get the resources. And then to reinforce this further, I thought, we've got tanklings now, maybe they can do industry, maybe they can build things. And so I can put down these food cooking buildings here, and then you boost the food flies into the town centre, but also into the food cooking building, and then you get cooked food out, and that flies into the town centre. And so basically the game revolves around making these resource chains. You want to make your resources fly around to as many different places as possible to multiply the points that they're worth, and they all end up going to the tankling colony and making them happy. And I think actually this is the first prototype I made. This was the version 5 at this point. This was the first prototype that I made where I was actually having fun playing this. I thought, this is a simple game. It doesn't really last much longer than 10 minutes, which is a problem, but at least it is fun for those 10 minutes. Until I realised a lurking problem, which is that these mechanics don't work in the case of loops. If you have a resource that flies into building A and then into building B and then flies into building A again, it creates a loop and then it will go around infinitely and it will crash the game. And, that's just no good. Especially when you think, if this is going to be a town inside a terrarium, it kind of needs to be sustainable. Sustainability and terrariums that kind of go together. And so it would be nice to have these loops where resources can go round in circles and keep getting turned into different forms and keep getting sort of recycled, right? And so I was stuck. I didn't really know what to do next. I didn't really know whether I should double down on this plan or whether I should cut my losses and just say, this isn't working, I've got to do something new. But thankfully it was Christmas, and so I took some time off to mull it over and to think things through. And during this break, I played a new game that recently came out called the Norp Apologue. It's a weird game. It's basically cookie clicker. You train up the Norps and they click the cookie, get the resources, buy more Norps, infinite cycle of more and more Norps, more and more clicking, more and more fragments. Cookie clicker, right? And what struck me about this game was just how charismatic these Norps are. They don't really do anything individually. They don't really have any facial expressions. But when you look at them as a whole, they're really charismatic. They have a sort of an ant-like swarm feeling to them, where maybe one ant doesn't have a personality, but a colony of ants does. And thinking back to my real-time prototype, I thought, that's where I've gone wrong. There's only 5 tanklings here. What I need is 500 tanklings, or even 5,000 tanklings. Then they can behave as a swarm, as a hive mind, and it'll be fun to play with them. It'll be like being a commander of an ant colony, a bit like in Age of Empires 2, you have all these villagers, and each villager is basically just an automaton that collects resources, but when you have 100 of them, it's really satisfying to watch them. And so I decided, right, let's try again with the real-time idea, but this time I'm gonna have thousands of tanklings. Well, immediately I ran into some trouble, because the Unity engine, which I was using to make this game, is ultimately not a very high performance engine. It runs, unfortunately, quite slowly. And so in order to make a game that had thousands of tanklings in it, I'm going to have to use Unity's data-oriented tech stack, or DOTS. This is a new mode in Unity that they've been working on for a while that basically is high performance. It lets you get 100 times, or in some cases even 1,000 times speed up on normal, ordinary Unity code. It was obvious right from the start that I was going to have to learn how to use this tech stack in order to make my vision of an ant colony really shine. And that meant following many hours of video tutorials, because the sad reality is that this mode of Unity is not easy to use at all. However, I can explain the concept behind how it works quite simply using an analogy. Imagine that you are trying to look up a sentence in a dictionary. Like, for example, you want to look up "everything changed when the Fire Nation attacked." You'd start by looking up the word everything. Well, that's under E, that's on page, you flick through it, that's on page 57. And then changed, oh, that's further this way, that's maybe on page 33. And so on and so on, you're flicking through, you're leafing through, where are all these words in the dictionary? And actually, in looking up that whole sentence in a dictionary, you are going to spend way more time leafing through the dictionary than you will actually reading it. And a computer works in much the same way. The slowest part of the computer is the memory, especially accessing new parts of the memory, moving from one location of memory to a distant, different one. This is super slow, and you really want to eliminate it by putting all of your data together in one piece. And so the idea is to take the old approach of object-oriented programming, which is fancy jargon but basically means your data and your behavior are bundled together into these little boxes called objects. You take that and you split the object apart so that you have data in one part of your code and you have behavior in another part of your code. And this means all of the data can then be bundled together into a big array of data in one location in your computer memory. And then the code, the behavior code, can iterate on that in a simple loop. This is what gives you the 100 times or perhaps even the 1,000 times speed increase. It took me a few weeks to get up to speed on how exactly to do this in Unity. It didn't help that Unity's been working on this for a number of years now, and in that time they've repeatedly changed the details of exactly how the dot system works, which means all documentation isn't always accurate. Had to go and piece things together and learn, what's the difference between the new version and the old version. It was a mess. Thankfully, there's this guy, Turbo Makes Games, who has a tutorial that's up to date on how exactly dots works, and several hours of tutorialing and several weeks of programming later, I had this. What I've made here is a crumb collecting example case, where the crumbs throw in from the right. These are like tiny bits of resources. The ants run to the right, they pick up the crumbs, they run to the left, and they throw them into the colony. And all of the ants are also trying to avoid each other, so you can see they're nicely spread out and they sort of organize themselves into lanes as they try and walk past each other without bumping into each other. I kept going, and after a bunch more iteration, I reached this point where we have a stress test of 10,000 ants collecting these little mushroom crumbs from these 10 mushrooms that are around their colony, and then bringing those crumbs back to the colony. This stress test I managed to get to run at 150 frames a second on my computer, despite the fact that there's 10,000 ants and probably another 10,000 crumbs on the screen at any point in time. This is the power of the dots system. Although the code I had to write to make this work was super complicated, once it was all running, it was running really well. And this boded well for the game because I'm probably not actually going to have 10,000 ants in the full game, but the fact that it's possible here means that the game should be able to run on older computers, and I do want, of course, as many people as possible to be able to play the game on their machine. Anyway, from here the rest was pretty straightforward, and I kept iterating towards the final gameplay. You place resources into your tank, they'll then be automatically harvested by the tanklings and taken back to the crafting buildings into the colony, and all of these tasks are automatically load balanced so that they all have an appropriate number of tanklings working on them. This means you don't have to micromanage all 1,000 little tanklings. Instead, you can focus on the building of their colony. I added 3 different types of score in the game. There's the number of tanklings you have, which you obviously want to raise because more tanklings equals more fun. And then there's happiness, which as you raise the happiness, the tanklings all get faster and faster, so it's like a multiplier on your tanklings. And then there's coins, which you use to buy more cards. Every card, when you place it, gives you at least one of these scores for each of their matches. Most of the time you get money, but some of them, like for example building cards, will give you more tanklings when you place them, and luxuries will give you more happiness when you place them. On top of this, your crafting cards can spawn you even more cards as you level them up, and these cards will be more powerful, like how the kiln down here creates clay huts, and then the clay huts give you tanklings. And that's pretty much it. It's overall pretty simple. You're just collecting as many resources as you can and watching those tanklings go. And I find it pretty peaceful and mesmerizing watching them run around, collect things, build things, craft things, and act as a big hive mind. I finally felt at this point like I'd found the fun. I found something that actually is fun to play, that I enjoy playing, that I want to come back to. And yet, I'm still not happy with this design. It started out as a minimalist town builder, and I did that because I thought a minimalist game would be a really good platform to build complexity on top of. But actually that was wrong. Minimalist games can't accept more complexity because it breaks their minimalism. They're not minimalist anymore. Or at least it's not very easy to work extra complexity in. And so I've gained a whole new appreciation for these games, like Islanders and Dorfromantik, and just how hard they are to design. The people who made these games did a really good job creating something so simple and yet so fun. So, what does that mean? What's next? I want to double down on the ant simulation. I want to put to one side the idea of a minimalist town builder and instead say, what gameplay actually will make the ant simulation shine the most? What do ants do? Well, they collect resources, they build things, they hunt and even go to war, right? And that last part, combat, I thought actually maybe that is what I should be focusing a little bit more on. And so the tower defense genre, or perhaps more accurately here, anthill defense, it seemed like a natural fit. Basically, we can keep a lot of the town building things, where you're gathering and you're producing your resources into better resources, but then we can feed that into the production of defenses and weapons. And then you can have waves of enemies that come in and try to destroy your anthill, and you're fighting them off and, collecting resources from them as well. And this idea really lends itself to all sorts of wacky ideas. You can have soldier ants, flying ants, pincers and stingers and sticky honey bombs and all sorts of things. You could even take inspiration from the Pikmin games, which has some really wacky enemy designs. So that's my new plan. Take these ants and build a game around them that's going to be part town builder and part tower defense. I'm going to be documenting my entire development process, all of the ups and downs and everything in between on this YouTube channel, so stick around if you want to see more. And if you want to follow development and even get involved in development, helping me bounce around ideas, do check out the Discord server, links in the description. And I've also put up all 6 prototypes, including the latest one with the tankling ant colony, on the itch.io page, linked in the description as well, so you can play them for yourself for free. That's all for now. And I'll be back soon with my progress on this anthill defense game.